Welcome to the AHI's 8th and final lecture on the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. In this lecture, we will cover the last 2 years of his presidency and of the Second World War. The successful landings in North Africa, with which we ended last time, were followed by difficult fighting against Rommel's Desert Army, the invasion of Sicily, the first European territory the Allies retook, and then, most brutally, the more than 2-year campaign up the length of Italy. Churchill had referred to the country as Europe's soft underbelly, but this proved untrue of its mountainous landscape and the Nazi forces' intense resistance. The Battle of the Atlantic was the 3-year struggle to control the seas between North America and Europe, which allowed the U.S. to reliably resupply Britain and the Soviet Union, both of which were dependent on American aid. As early as May of 1941, Roosevelt had written to Churchill, "I believe the outcome of this struggle is going to be decided in the Atlantic, and unless Hitler can win there, he cannot win anywhere in the world." Churchill referred to it as, quote, "this shapeless, measureless peril," and said the Battle of the Atlantic was the only thing that had ever truly frightened him during the war. The defeat of the German U-boat attacks on Allied shipping by 1943 meant that both Britain and the Soviet Union could receive U.S. and Canadian aid largely unimpeded, in contrast to the enormous losses the Allied merchant shipping had suffered earlier in the war. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, the Great Battle of Midway in mid-1942 had made it nearly impossible for Japan to move further into the Southwest Pacific as plans for the invasion of New Caledonia, Fiji, and New Zealand were shelved. There was no longer a threat to Pearl Harbor or the American mainland, as there would have been had Japan been able to move forward with plans to cut Allied supply lines to Australia and the South Pacific. This in turn might have caused irresistible political pressure on Roosevelt to de-emphasize European combat and combat preparations in favor of the Pacific theater. The Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers at Midway, plus more than 300 aircraft and many irreplaceable pilots. In that battle, another consequence of the battle was that it allowed a successful island-hopping campaign in which American troops sailed to the different islands the Japanese had occupied and stormed the beaches to gain those specks of land at a bloody cost. The closer to Japan they got, the easier it was to bomb it. Now, let's take a few minutes to discuss what was happening at home before returning to the war itself. One of the most controversial aspects of Roosevelt's conduct of the war is the Japanese internment. Japanese Americans were highly concentrated on the West Coast, and there was widespread concern about the security of the aircraft factories and shipyards in that region. A history of racism against Japanese Americans also increased the suspicions on the West Coast that Japanese couldn't be trusted to be loyal to the United States. Another unfortunate factor was what might be called the total war mentality. Thousands of non-citizens from Japan, Germany, and Italy had been arrested within days after Pearl Harbor on the president's orders, in some cases even before Congress had declared war. And this was another example of the total war mentality, which became widespread in the 20th century, doing not only whatever it would take to win, but anything that might possibly help to win. In February 1942, when the internment decision was made with the president's permission, and he then signed an executive order putting it into effect, the Japanese were still advancing across the southern Pacific with little opposition. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote in his diary that large-scale Japanese evacuation would, quote, "make a tremendous hole in our constitutional system," end quote, but the Japanese, quote, "racial characteristics are such that we cannot understand or trust even the citizen Japanese." He feared that if Japan attained naval dominance in the Pacific, it might try an invasion of the U.S. Reflecting on Pearl Harbor, Stimson added, "The people of the United States have made an enormous mistake in underestimating the Japanese." Accordingly, the Secretary of War recommended that Roosevelt approve the request by General John DeWitt, the defense commander for the western U.S., that Japanese residents be removed from the West Coast. Ultimately, about 110,000 people of Japanese descent, about 70% of whom were U.S. citizens, were removed to internment camps. The mass internment can be seen not only as reflecting bigotry and paranoia toward Japanese Americans, but also as an especially troubling example of a general big government mindset that took hold in the months after Pearl Harbor. Americans soon lived under a regimentation that is little considered in looking back on Roosevelt's 12-year presidency. Basic everyday activities during the war, like driving, were strictly limited, and rationing of almost everything was another harsh reality in these years. Basic laws passed within months after American entry into the war allowed the president to control much industrial activity, and the government's ability to tell firms that wanted government contracts for war-related work, a large percentage of the nation's business sector, how to operate was another major example of wartime statism. Businesses and citizens often felt greatly imposed on by government, leading to much greater discomfort than the later narrative of overwhelming domestic unity during these years suggests. As historian and political scientist Ira Katznelson wrote several years ago in Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, a particularly insightful book on mid-20th century American government, the two War Powers Acts passed in the first few months after Pearl Harbor gave the president, quote, more power over American capitalism than he had achieved even during the New Deal's radical moment. The December 1941 law conferred authority to modify existing government contracts, speed up production without competitive bidding, seize foreign property for use in the war, and regulate all trade, credit, and economic transactions with other countries. The March 1942 law granted the president even more far-reaching discretionary power to control the nation's economy. Its provisions gave him the means to allocate resources for defense purposes, quote, in such manner, upon such conditions, and to such extent as he shall deem necessary in the public interest. These authorizations included the ability to seize immediately land and personal property for war purposes, set prices for government purchases, impose priorities on production and on the delivery of goods and services, violate prior contracts, and control all forms of transportation. Above all, the act furnished the president with what one writer has called tremendous, effectively unrestrained power over resource allocation, including a provision that he could allocate any materials and direct any facility to produce for defense or export, quote, as he shall deem necessary or appropriate in the public interest, and to promote national defense. What all of this translated into, in practical terms, was extreme power for an agency called the War Production Board. There's also a National War Labor Board created by presidential executive order, which could enforce its preferred settlements in the event of labor disputes, and the Office of Price Administration established by Congress to prevent, quote, abnormal price increases and eliminate profiteering, hoarding, and speculation. Just as there were local draft boards throughout America, there were also 8,000 boards throughout the country which functioned as local versions of the Office of Price Administration, policing its pricing policies. Even greater centralized control over the economy was enacted in the fall of 1942 when Congress passed the Economic Stabilization Act, which gave Roosevelt the power to adjust all prices and wages as he saw fit for the purpose of aiding the prosecution of the war or correcting what the law called gross inequities. To carry out these powers, Roosevelt created the powerful Office of Economic Stabilization. Washington bureaucrats could and did cut off supplies to businesses that didn't comply with the new federal rules and regulations, while employers could not even hire without government's authorization. By the time the war ended, according to Katznelson, the federal government owned a remarkable 40% of the country's capital assets. Even salaries were strictly regulated, limited to $25,000 a year after taxes. The sales of new cars were banned. Income taxes skyrocketed, and exemption levels for them were reduced. As the intellectual historian George Nash later noted, the war had brought a, quote, domestic superstate to America and further success for a philosophy of tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect. Another interesting aspect of the war years is the division between the left wing of the Roosevelt administration and the more moderate mainstream of the Democratic Party, which was strongly represented in the administration, as well as Congress, despite the president's own sympathy with the left-of-center people who called themselves liberals. An important new addition to the administration's left wing was former Agriculture Secretary Henry Wallace, whom Roosevelt had named as his vice presidential choice in 1940. It also included Mrs. Roosevelt and two of the leading implementers of the New Deal, the president's top aide, Harry Hopkins, and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes. One major concern for the self-described liberals close to FDR was that America developed the greatest possible friendship for its ally of convenience, the Soviet Union. Another of their major concerns was civil rights for African Americans, about which a little, but ultimately not much, was done during the war. Another was their strong identification with unions. And yet another was the administration liberals' suspicion of the growing influence of America's corporate and financial leadership, even though such influence was inevitable if the nation was to fully mobilize its resources, as indeed it did, to win the war. In addition to the struggles within the administration, there were Roosevelt's growing difficulties with Congress. The Democrats had nearly lost their majority in the House in the 1942 midterm elections, and the Republicans also had a strong presence in the Senate. Combined with the huge representation of Southern Democrats on Capitol Hill, this created a serious problem for the president. Congressional scrutiny of certain aspects of FDR's conduct of the war was at times substantial. One of the most important decisions the president made during the war was his and the Allies' unconditional surrender policy stated at the early 1943 Casablanca Conference. Part of the policy's purpose was to reassure the Soviets, since they were disappointed that there would not be an invasion of the continent in 1943. But it also meant there would be no possibility of ending the war on negotiated terms, no matter what those terms might be, and that more destruction of Germany and more Allied lives, rather than less, would be required. The origins of the unconditional surrender policy are interesting, as are the reactions to it by many in the U.S. military. Roosevelt was incorrect when he said the unconditional surrender principle had just, quote, popped into my mind at the press conference at the end of the Casablanca Conference. Actually, it may have originated with the State Department committee, which was set up to discuss post-war foreign policy aims. When the committee's chairman told Roosevelt that it was inclined to recommend unconditional surrender, Roosevelt said he fully agreed. Churchill and General Eisenhower seem to have been troubled by at least the public announcement of the policy. Major General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, later recalled, "Everybody I knew at the time when they heard this said, 'How stupid can you be?' All the soldiers and the airmen who were fighting this war wanted the Germans to quit tomorrow. A child knew, once you said this to the Germans, they were going to fight to the last man." Unconditional surrender also meant that Roosevelt would be uninterested in dealing with the German resistance, which was plotting a coup against Hitler. In any case, at whatever cost, it did mean unconditional and undisputable military defeat for America's enemies. "It is of the utmost importance," Roosevelt said late in the war, "that every person in Germany should realize that this time Germany is a defeated nation." Among the other major questions about American policy during the war are the different endgame scenarios and the great might-have-been that is associated with them. Was the Soviets' decade-long control of Eastern and much of Central Europe inevitable? There's been much criticism of Roosevelt and Allied Commander General Eisenhower for not prioritizing the eastward movement of Allied troops. Had this been done, the U.S. and Britain might have been in a better position to minimize future Soviet control in these parts of the continent. But the feasibility of their options is not clear. At issue were the possibility of a drive into German-controlled Austria from the south and the possibility of a faster drive toward Berlin and Prague from the west. The first of these, the movement of troops through a mountain pass called the Ljubljana Gap, at the northern tip of what became Yugoslavia, raises the question of whether large numbers could have moved through the gap in the face of intensive and skilled resistance by the many German forces. The very difficult terrain would also have meant an extremely difficult supply line for the Western troops, even if they had reached Austria in large numbers. In addition, it would have been difficult for Roosevelt to delay the augmentation of U.S. troop strength in the Pacific theater that would be needed to quickly defeat Japan. He had already told Churchill in June of 1944 that he could not politically survive even a slight setback in Operation Overlord, the invasion of northern France that was about to begin on D-Day, if large numbers of Western troops had been sent instead to the Balkans, and that fact were known to the American people. Roosevelt had insisted on Overlord despite Churchill's continued doubts. had it been postponed for another year until 1945, the damage to Britain by V-2 rockets, which the Germans launched from occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, would have been even worse, and perhaps not survivable. It is also not clear that the Americans could have gotten to Berlin before the Soviets at all, or if they did, that they could have done it without enormous casualties. Eisenhower believed that taking Berlin first was not worth it, especially given that joint occupation of the German capital by the Western Allies and the Soviets had already been agreed to. Finally, there was the question of how much territory the U.S. could hold for how long after the war. Americans wanted the boys home. At the opening session of the Yalta Conference with Stalin in February 1945, Roosevelt said the U.S. could not keep a large army in Europe after the war ended, or even occupy Germany for more than 2 years. A year before Yalta, in March of 1944, the president had said America was, quote, fighting to make a world in which tyranny and aggression cannot exist. A world based upon freedom, equality, and justice. A world in which all persons, regardless of race, color, or creed, may live in peace, honor, and dignity. Ultimately, the war's results, great though they were, fell short of that extremely high standard. Another question about U.S. policy in the later years of the war involved the extent of our bombing. Much of it was aimed at the destruction of entire cities in order to break the German and Japanese populations' morales. Although much of Germany was destroyed by early 1945 by American and British bombers, it still took an invasion of the country to bring about its surrender. In contrast, there was no invasion of Japan, an undertaking that would have cost enormous numbers of American lives. This was due not only to the atomic bomb, and probably also to the Soviet Union's eventual entry into the Pacific War at the last minute, but also to the fact that the Army Air Force had intensively bombed Japan long before the atomic weapon was completed, demonstrated to work, and dropped on Japan almost immediately thereafter. The firebombing of Tokyo in early 1945, which destroyed more than 16 square miles of the city, has been called, quote, the greatest single disaster incurred by any enemy in military history. The total damage was even greater than that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the A-bomb, with, quote, more casualties than in any other single military action in the history of the world. A Western-born priest at a university there later recalled how, quote, a hot, swift wind began to blow from the rim of the blast toward its center. A twisting wind, which spread the flames very quickly, he said. Thus, everywhere the people ran, there was fire, in front of them and in back of them, and closing in on them from the sides, so that there were only a very few who escaped. Japanese records indicated that more than 250,000 buildings, or more than 1/4 of Tokyo, were destroyed, and more than 1 million people left homeless. It took nearly a month to remove all the dead from the ruins. According to the official casualty toll, more than 83,000 residents died and nearly 41,000 were wounded. 2 days after the firebombing of Tokyo came the firebombing of the city of Nagoya, followed quickly by massive raids on Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya for a second time. At that point, the incendiary material with which to wreak destruction had temporarily run out. The B-29 bombers went back to work on Japan several weeks later after the invasion of Okinawa. By mid-June, the nation's 6 major industrial cities were in ruins. The bombing continued for the whole time, up to the dropping of the 2 atomic weapons on August 6th and 9th. One thing we are never likely to know about World War II and President Roosevelt is the extent to which his failing health, including possibly failing mental abilities, may have affected his decision-making in the last half year or more of his life. But in any case, it is hard to disagree with Republican Senator Robert Taft, one of FDR's chief domestic critics in his later years, who said, "The president's death removed the greatest figure of our time at the very climax of his career, and shocks the world, to which his words and actions were more important than those of any other man. He dies a hero of the war, for he literally worked himself to death in the service of the American people." Although Roosevelt's death by a massive stroke on April 12, 1945, less than a month before the German surrender, was not surprising to any knowledgeable official, it was a powerful jolt to the American people. As historian Eric Larrabee later wrote, for many of the young men and women in the armed services, he was the president, the only one they had ever been consciously aware of. He was quite simply there, a part of their lives, and he exuded confidence, a sense of being on top of the world. The idea of anyone else being president did not naturally come to mind. That and the buoyancy, the hat brim turned up in front, the cigarette holder at a jaunty angle, made him an unbeatable politician and a reassuring commander-in-chief. It contributed to the widespread sense of deprivation and emptiness when he died. Although this is the final lecture on the Roosevelt presidency, there are a few more points to make, both on the war and on domestic policy, that will be included in some of our early lectures on Ronald Reagan. Until next time, thanks for listening.